So do go present. So we are going live in 5 seconds.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. We are live for the second session of the day. We have with us Natalia Neverova. Thank you so much, Natalia, for joining us. Natalia is a lead research scientist in Facebook in Paris, and I will actually let her introduce herself more to tell us more. So I know she's been doing great work in computer vision, in pose estimation, semantic segmentation, but she will tell us more about this. Thank you, Natalia, for joining us.
Okay, thanks so much for having me today, and thanks for the kind introduction. So just to give you a little bit more context, I did my PhD between INSA Lyon in France and the University of Guelph in Canada under supervision of Christian Wolff and Graham Taylor. So from the beginning of my PhD, I've been working on core computer vision problems, including first action recognition, gesture recognition, pose estimation. I also spent some time as a visiting researcher at Google, where we worked on problems like multimodal authentication on mobile devices. And then a little bit more than 4 years ago, I joined Facebook AI research in Paris. And now I'm supporting a European side of computer vision efforts at FAIR. And we have a team which is split between Paris and London. And we also have some folks in Tel Aviv. Okay, so let me start with the actual talk. The title today is super broad. It says geometry and computer vision, but I have to say right away that I'm definitely not going to cover all of it. I will not even attempt that. So instead of, I'll cover one specific line of research that we are pursuing at FAIR. And I encourage you to definitely look into this area more because I think it's one of the most interesting directions of computer vision today. Okay, so I don't know how many people in this audience are familiar with computer vision and at what level. So just to give you a little bit more context, you probably do know that, but computer vision together with other applications with applied field of deep learning made tremendous progress over the last couple of years since ImageNet was released back in 2012. And today, the 2D computer vision or 2D image video understanding reached that level of performance that it actually can drive and enable meaningful applications and drive experiences, which are becoming like most essential to our everyday lives. Right, and by 2D understanding here, I mean basic recognition tasks such as image classification or object detection, instance segmentation, semantic segmentation, and eventually detection of 2D landmarks. So to show you a little bit what we can do at this level today and also motivate our research in 3D computer vision, I'll just mention a couple of Facebook applications. Please do not read that much into corporate framing of that. It doesn't really matter. Different companies, different labs have their own set of tasks. But of course, we all are researchers and the scientific challenges behind that are mostly the same. At the same time, I do think that lots of students are getting into this field for this specific reason, because how many exciting applications you can do with that. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to mention is one Facebook product that was released just a couple of weeks ago. It's called Facebook Shops. And the essence of it is the assumption that in the context of global pandemic, the way how we interact with each other, how we interact with digital content, how we buy things changed dramatically. And we need to somewhat reinvent the way, for example, how small businesses can reach their audience. Right, so this specific project was about enabling businesses to automatically label all products or all brands that appear in their, for example, Instagram or Facebook posts and stories. And then when users see something that they really like on that picture, they can click through it and buy this specific item in some shop. Okay, and this has had a huge impact on the business side, but I also want to say that at the very core of this experience is a large computer vision framework. And this is really showing the limits, what we can do with the simplest 2D computer vision tasks today. So this is based on a combination of image classification, instance detection in terms of bounding boxes, and also object or image retrieval. And as of today, we're able to recognize and retrieve several hundreds of thousands of different objects and different products. And this is a huge network which was trained with more than 80 different losses on a combination of different internal and external data sets. And it's really showing what we can achieve by just scaling the pipelines that we already invented today. Okay, this is cool, but it's also obvious that at some point pretty soon we'll hit the wall when just scaling of these simple pipelines will not be enough anymore. There are a couple of different flavors of problems that we can encounter. The first one is, of course, that we'll have this really long tail distribution in our data, both in terms of what kind of categories and objects we can encounter, but also in terms of different poses or different contexts where objects appear, or for example, we can have severe occlusions where just by detecting objects, it will be really hard to reason about them. So in this case, it would be actually to get some more priors about object geometry, understand how they deform. Another problem is if we want to enable a bit more interesting, entertaining experiences on top of that, that would also require more detailed understanding of geometry and 3D. For example, one obvious application is virtual try-on. If you want to buy some specific piece of clothing, you want to see how it will be looking at your body, you need to have a model of geometry of your body and also understand how you will be, what your dynamics will be in this specific piece of clothing. Or if you want to buy a piece of furniture, you probably want to imagine how it will fit in your room. And for that, you would need to understand the 3D layout of your surroundings. Okay, so this is just for the simplest application of shopping-related experiences, but we have much more of those which also require 3D. One of them is augmented reality applications. There can be all sorts of flavors for that as well, starting from simple games and restaurant menus to very complex systems such as AI assistants, for example. And in many contexts, you would also need to understand geometry. Maybe it can be just extracting simple surfaces, but often you would need something more complex than that. Or if you want to have AR filters, such as, for example, in Messenger and Zoom, when you want to project a mask on your face, you also need to have a prior on 3D geometry of the face and how it behaves. Okay, another direction is virtual reality applications. And here, one specific thing that we want to do is to create digital avatars, which would be looking highly realistic and almost indistinguishable from real images and videos. Right, and to train networks that would be able to generate that, we need to first get training data in the form of multi-view scans of this specific individual. And then at test time, when you actually wear your virtual reality device, the only signal that you have about your movements is articulation of your mouth. And also you can see how your eyes are moving because you have a camera installed inside your device. This is a very limited input, and from that you need to reconstruct the whole appearance in the person and make it highly realistic. So for that, you also need to understand geometry, you need to understand textures, lighting, and all aspects at the border of computer graphics and computer vision. So these are complex systems, but even in the simplest applications, for example, if you want to convert 2D images on Facebook to 3D, you would need some model which would be either explicitly reconstructing 3D environments from this image and then reprojecting it somehow, or you can have an implicit model that would be generating novel views from this given image, but without this explicit step of 3D reconstruction. This is also a valid approach. Okay, so this was some motivation on the application side. I hope it convinced you that computer vision is a really fun field to be at. But also as a scientist, I have to say that I do believe that 3D vision today is one of the most challenging most exciting and complete directions. And finally, now we may be ready to start working on that more closely. So if you want, if you look at the distribution of topics, the previous CPR, ECCV, even NeurIP submissions right now, papers on 3D computer vision are becoming one of the mainstream mainstream tasks. Okay, so we have a couple of different directions around geometry and computer vision in our group. If I want to cluster those somehow, I would probably have three main topics. The first of them I call dense pose estimation, but this is essentially learning correspondences between objects belonging to the same class, or correspondences between differently deformed versions of the same object. And in terms of applications, this can be used for texture mapping, for example, where you need to create some filters and you project some parts of the texture from one object to another. So this is still essentially 2D task, but it's tightly coupled with 3D geometry estimation, and you can solve these two challenges together or separately, depending on your application. The second cluster is 3D reconstruction per se. And as a group, we're interested in understanding people, deformable objects, and also reconstruction of 3D scenes. And the third direction is relevant to what I mentioned in the context of converting 2D images to 3D images. This is called novel view synthesis, basically a class of generative models that allows you to generate novel views of the same object without explicit 3D reconstruction. So for this task, I'll be focusing mainly on the first direction because this is just closer to my research, but I also try to draw some connections to other areas as well. Okay, so this is the team both on London side and Paris side. We have both research scientists and research engineers, and I just cannot stress enough that none of this work would not be possible without these people. All right. Okay, so let's just get back to the very first image of this presentation where I showed you the state of the art in 2D computer vision. So what it basically tells us is that today what we're reasonably good at is seeing understanding at the level of individual objects. What we would like to do next from here is twofold. First, we would like to move from object level understanding to pixel level understanding in the sense that we don't just want to say that this pixel belongs to this specific object, but we also want to localize specific on its surface and assign it to some semantic meaning, right? So for example, this is like this specific part on the shoulder, which is mapping to that specific part on the 3D model of the person. This task corresponds to the problem of learning correspondences that I mentioned before. And the second direction that we want to push it is actually explicit 3D reconstruction for each object category. And if you want to understand better how these two challenges are related, I find it useful to look at it from the perspective of computer graphics, because they have this set of really nice assumptions. And what computer graphics basically tells us is that if you want to render an image of a specific object, what you need to know is first the shape of this object, as have the mesh. Then you need to know the texture. The texture is somewhat decorrelated from the shape. It's represented in some normalized space, which we call UV space. And then, of course, you need to know camera, lighting, and these kind of things. Right, so in these terms, we can say that estimating object shape from an image, this is the task of 3D reconstruction, and estimating texture from an image, this is the task of learning correspondences. And in this case, we can assume that the shape is given or just not interesting for our application. Okay, let's dive in a little bit deeper into the task of learning correspondences. We can formulate it in a couple of different ways. The simplest one would be to just establish correspondences between two different points belonging to two images, either of the same object in different poses, or of different objects from the same category, or even from different categories whenever there is some sort of similar structure. Instead of relating two images to each other, you can go through somewhat factorized mapping and say that first you want to map the first image onto the surface of some reference 3D surface, and then from there you want to remap to the second image, and this formulation is equivalent. And what is important to understand here is that the geometry of this reference model in the middle is largely irrelevant to the task. The only thing you care about is the index set over which you do the mapping. And depending on object topology, that may change, but the majority of objects can be just mapped to the sphere, and this assumption is sufficient for most of texture map applications. But in practice, if you want to couple on the task of learning correspondences with 3D estimation, you may actually want to formulate it as mapping points from an image onto corresponding points on the surface of the 3D model. And this is also a valid approach. And in this case, if you estimate correspondences from the image, you can actually use them directly to fit your 3D model into this image and get the geometry. Okay, so this was the general framework. One of specific applications that we are interested in is learning correspondences, for example, for humans, if you want to create digital avatars or AR filters. And if we look at the history of how this field was evolving, there are a couple of different approaches to learning correspondences. One of them is the most obvious is just to use synthetic data, use 3D models, render synthetic images using them. And by doing that, you have the ground truth correspondences for training right away. This is straightforward, but the problem with this approach is that, of course, you have domain gap between the real and synthetic images, and achieving that level of realism to bridge this gap, and also to achieve that level of variety of your data set to train sufficiently large models is really hard, right? Because you would need to create 3D models manually with all varieties of shape, textures, lighting, and so on. And this is just expensive and slow. Also, if you want to focus on deformable objects or particular categories of deformable objects such as people, what you may want to do is to scan them using 3D scans or multi-camera setups. So this is showing you the Panoptic Studio, which was first created in CMU a couple of years ago. Now we have one of those at Facebook as well. And those studios have calibrated sets of potentially a couple of hundreds of different cameras, including RGB cameras and depth cameras, and with calibrated lighting as well. And it allows you to capture geometry of moving objects together with geometry in dynamics, and then just using since your system is calibrated, then you can extract the ground truth correspondences between points from different views and use that as training data. Again, using that data directly for training is a bit challenging because you would need to scan lots of different subjects with different shapes and appearances, so the variety in backgrounds would be a challenge. And also, if you want to capture, for example, humans in interaction, you need to build huge DOMs, and it's just not always practical. A bit more pragmatic approach to using this data is to combine those scans and learn parametric 3D models of a given object that can be somehow used for learning correspondences instead. And for humans specifically, this was a direction enabled by Michael Black's group a couple of years ago. And what they did is that they took roughly 6,000 scans of human bodies from this user data set, and they learned the parametric 3D model of a human body where the parameters are representing both variations in shapes and poses for the given class. And then this model can be used in different ways. The first one, this was done back in 2017. You can just use this model to pose to obtain different poses and different body shapes, reproject different textures, and then superimpose those renderings with random backgrounds. And this way you can construct a synthetic data set which will be useful for some of human understanding tasks, for example, body parsing, or again, learning correspondences. But again, as in the previous case, the domain gap between the real and synthetic data is still quite significant in this case. If you want to work with a little bit closer to real data, what you can do, for example, for faces, is to extract sparse landmarks from images using some sort of landmark detector, and then use those to fit a deformable template for face. And this way you obtain those correspondences just from this fit. And then you can use those points to retrain another predictor, which would be producing dense mapping between the image and the face. And this is working quite nicely in this specific setting because faces are just slightly deformable. There isn't that much self-occlusion, that much articulation, and also there's like at least a couple of I don't know, 10, 20 years of research that went into optimizing the deformable templates. So this is really building on the prior work. But you see for faces it's working quite nicely, and you can extract the dense mapping, which is shown at the bottom on the left. And from that, you can in turn extract landmarks or segmentation or think about any other tasks. Okay, but what if you want to work with full body articulation, not just faces? It's becoming much more challenging. Just fitting a 3D model into a set of 2D annotated key points in practice does not really work. So this was attempted back in 2017 with CVPR paper by Michael Black's group as well. And what they did there is they took a couple of data sets for pose estimation and just fit their 3D model into 2D key points, and then asked annotators to select good and bad fits. And the good fits were proposed as a data set for 3D pose estimation. It worked only to some extent because I don't remember the exact number, but I think something like 20% of those fits actually survived that quality check. And still you can see that this is quite approximate pose representation, just because, yeah, because of self-occlusions and other factors, it's just too challenging. So instead of going this route, back in 2018, what we did is we proposed data-driven approach for learning correspondences for people. And the task there was formulated as before. Given an image of a person or several people, we want to map all pixels belonging to this image onto the surface of some canonical 3D model representing human body. And instead of obtaining those correspondences from fitting 3D model, we actually ask annotators to label those correspondences manually. And there are a couple of advantages of doing it this way. First of them is that you can use any model as a reference, but then you're not tied to it when you do the actual prediction. So you can go actually beyond the expressivity of the specific 3D mesh. And also you're working directly with in the wild data with all its complexity. At the same time, you know that by collecting human annotations, there, of course, can be some sort of errors and biases in how this labeling was done. So to implement this in practice, we took the SMPL 3D model shown in the slide. We split it into a number of segments representing different body parts, 24 of them. And in this case, each segment is isomorphic to a plane and can be parameterized with a set of two-dimensional coordinates, which we call UV coordinates. They are separate and independent for each body segment. For the annotation pipeline, we took all images containing people from the COCO dataset. After some filtering, it was about 50,000 images. And then for each of them, we first asked the annotators to segment them into body parts which were predefined on the surface of the 3D model. And then for each segment, we randomly and uniformly sampled a set of points and on the left show the annotators the original image with the sample points, and on the right we showed them different synthetic views rendered from the 3D model. And the task for them was to click on the same points that they are seeing on the real image, but on the rendered views. And since these views are rendered from the 3D model, we, by definition, know the correspondence between them and the surface of the 3D model, which gives us the slot mapping between the real image and the 3D model. And there are a couple of technicalities how you want to implement it to improve the quality of these annotations. For example, if you show different views of the same body part from different camera positions, the annotators can choose the one which is more convenient for annotating. But then once they click, the same point is displayed on on all other views wherever it's visible. So this way they can correct each other and get a bit more precise estimates. So this way so this is just a video illustrating the process. And this way we have annotated 50,000 images, which roughly corresponds to 5 million annotated correspondences. This took us roughly 4 months with 80 annotators working on it full time. That was a quite laborious effort, but at the end we were quite satisfied with the quality of those annotations. And even if at the beginning there was some learning curve, at the end annotators arrived to quite high quality of labeling. And here are a couple of examples of how those annotations look when displayed on the images from Coco. So we filtered out those that were too small or too much occluded, and most of instances are annotated. And we have roughly 100 points per image. Okay, so if you want to learn correspondences this way, you need a evaluation metric. And since it's a Coco data set and yet another recognition task, we try to be consistent with other metrics used on this data. So we use average recall and average precision as the main metric, with something which we call geodesic point similarity as the matching criteria between different points. This is the idea is similar to how, for example, key point estimation is evaluated, but instead of calculating distances just in pixels between the ground truth position and the estimated position, we first remap both the ground truth and the estimation on the surface of the 3D model, and then calculate the geodesic distance and do evaluation based on that. In terms of architecture, this was implemented on top of Mascar CNN, which was, you probably know, a paper at ICCB 2017. It was Best Paper Award. So for this task, we just designed an additional head. So the Mascar CNN architecture includes a backbone, which can be ResNet or anything you like. And then a set of heads which are performing different tasks, starting from bounding box detection, classification, but also instance detection, and so on. Right. So for this task, we had a separate head which was outputting 3 kinds of outputs. First of them is the index of the body segment, and the other 2 were U and V coordinates corresponding to each segment number. So test time, how it's decoded is that we first get the segmentation index and then look up U and V coordinates in the corresponding plane in the predictions. And this is how, since even if the annotations in the ground truth data are sparse by construction, the network outputs dense mapping between the image pixels and the 3D model, which is shown in the 3rd column of each group here. And here is just a video illustrating how the model performs. This is some random video from the post-check data set. There is no temporal smoothing at all, so it's just frame-by-frame predictions. And you can see that at least for more or less simple poses and like reasonably sized objects, it works well. But even for those that are occluded, it still produces reasonable predictions. Okay, and just as an example of simplest application of this framework, the first thing you can do is, for example, take any random synthetic texture and reproject it on the surface of each person in the image. Right, so here I'm showing the textures on the right, and on the left you can see like the simplest version of the augmented reality filter, which is obtained with DensePose. Okay, and this works more or less in real time, depending on your backbone. So it's roughly 12 FPS on a desktop machine, but we also have a mobile version with a compressed network, which also works close to real time. The code and the models for this work are released. They are now part of the Detection 2 repository, which is implemented in PyTorch. And I also wanted to mention that every year we run COCO challenges for different tasks. You know that those challenges have been run for years for tasks of object detection or segmentation, or recently pan-object segmentation. Over the last couple of years, we also have a DensePose track, and it just opened, so we'll have a deadline for submissions on July 31st this year. We'll have dedicated workshop at ECCV later this summer. So if you're interested in playing with those models and see if you can push performance, I would encourage you to take a look and try for yourself. Okay, so I can stop for a minute here if you have questions, or I can continue.
Yes, it would be great to stop because we have quite a number of questions. I will just show them on the screen. In just a second. Okay, I hope you can all see them. So yeah, first question, some work show that deep learning models are focusing on texture and somewhat ignore shape of objects. Is that a problem? And if yes, how do we solve this in computer vision?
Well, I guess it's really application specific, right? So I guess you mean one of those works when you try to do object like image classification and then look at what kind of views are most prominent, right? So I don't think that it's a problem for those tasks. It just learns the distribution which is appropriate for that. I don't think that in 3D computer vision this is something that's so in 3D computer vision we're explicitly kind of focusing on these two sides of this problem separately, right? So in what I've described, we're explicitly looking at texture. In 3D computer vision, when you want to reconstruct maps, you'll be explicitly looking at at the shape of the object. So it's actually one of the way maybe to refocus the attention of the network and somewhat overcome this challenge.
Okay. So in 3D modeling of human bodies, can we take into account the effect of clothing, that it can significantly affect the accuracy in calculating the geometry of the 3D model?
Yeah, it's definitely a problem because we have two main directions of research here. One is based on parametric model, where we just assume that there is no clothing, so we have this like naked 3D model and we try to fit that into image. The other direction is focusing on like high fidelity 3D reconstruction, but not necessarily like reconstructing semantics. And I think we still need to bridge the gap between two and see how we can model both aspects in a single framework.
Okay. Another question, what is the bottleneck to estimate poses in the wild, in real images, like from YouTube videos? Because most of the papers published on pose estimation, they use nice clean data sets like MPI or something like that.
Right. Well, I don't know if it's relating to 2D poses or 3D poses. For 3D poses, one of the main remaining challenges is occlusions, right? Because if we want to fit 3D models, we need to have high visibility and a large number of key points visible to do that. So that's a solved problem. For 2D poses, assignment of different key points to different instances is also a problem in the case of occlusions.
Okay. Another question. Okay, this is kind of asking for a solution to the whole problem. If I capture images of an object using a cell phone, how can I get poses, intrinsic and extrinsic parameters immediately to reconstruct 3D by using deep learning? Are you aware of this kind of systems that work on a phone?
There are definitely a couple of works that you can. Well, for some phones have 3D, have depth sensors right away, right? So you can use some sort of like Kinect Fusion-like algorithm to get a point cloud and measure from that immediately. But even just by capturing video from in somewhat like turntable scenario, you can use standard frameworks to try to approximate it. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll take one or two more. A silly question, that's what the participant wrote, but I don't think it's silly. Do you think we'll ever be able to generate an animation movie using a storyline as input?
Yeah, I really hope so. I actually know that some at least a couple of groups are starting to work on that, and it will be maybe taking a couple of years, but I do think we'll get there.
One more commercial question. Do you have the shopping model available publicly?
No.
Okay. Okay, and one more, and then we are going to forward. Is modern pose estimation ruled by CNNs on 2D images or graph neural nets that run on 3D models?
Modern parents, not sure where the question is coming from, but yeah, if you want to get poses from images, that would be just from like convolution networks from pixels, and you can have a graph neural networks as an addition to that, but at least for feature extraction, I guess you would have some convolutional networks first.
And I think there's a question I will skip. That I quite like. Have you encountered any challenge in 3D modeling of the human body across different skin colors? Is there any bias in the current data sets for such modeling?
Yeah, I wouldn't like to dive too deeply into that. We did not look into that specifically because those systems are still very close to production, really far from production and any kinds of practical applications. So we'll get there, but just not yet.
Okay, great. Maybe we can continue, and then we will get back to the questions. So if you could just press resume presentation in your screen. I stopped presenting. Okay. So you need to press resume presentation in the right corner. Yeah, that's great.
That works?
Yes, that should be fine. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so from here, I'll continue in the same direction, just maybe highlighting a couple of more challenges and directions for ongoing and future work. Yeah, so if you want to look a bit deeper into augmented reality applications and texture mapping, what you can do, apart from the simplest filters that I showed before, you can actually try to extract avatars from single images and use those textures as filters for something else, right? So one example of that would be you have an image, you run your dense pose predictor, you map those pixels on the surface of the 3D model, do maybe some processing, and you get a partially reconstructed texture. And what remains to be done, at least at some rough for some rough quality avatar, is to reconstruct those parts of the appearance which are not directly observable from this given frame. And to do that, you can use any sort of in-painting technique. And what is convenient about that is that you can perform this in-painting directly in the texture space. So here is an example of the pipeline that we proposed back in ACCV 2018, I think. So here we took a couple of images of the same person, or you can use even a single image. We projected the texture to the normalized UV space using dense pose, and then used an autoencoder in the middle, which would be learning to reconstruct masked unobserved pixel from observed input. And in terms of learning, you can either use a couple of different views of the same person, asking the network to reconstruct those pixels which are visible in the second view, or if you only have a single image, then you can just split it somehow into parts and then predict one part of the texture from another one, but from the same view. In this way, you can get fully textured avatars. One of drawbacks of doing that in the texture space is that in this case you're relying on the 3D model, and this way, as we just discussed, we cannot really model clothing. But the advantage of doing it this way is that you get the generalization over the pose space for free, because you're working in this normalized UV space. Right, so to be able to address both challenges and that specific work, we had a two-stream model where we performed this reconstruction at the same time and image in the texture space, and then fused the outputs. And this way we got better generalization, but also we're able to preserve elements of the clothing and attributes. So this is a proof of concept. So you have an image on the top left. We get a partially observed texture, reconstruct the rest, and then can use that as a texture for augmented reality filter. So this is, of course, like in terms of quality, this is not super realistic, but there are different directions we can look into to improve the quality. One of them would be, instead of just using a single image, you can use Visio, but also you can train models which would be personalized for this given person. Okay, one example in this direction was actually work from NVIDIA, which was called video-to-video synthesis. And what they did here is that they took videos of professional dancers, they ran dance pose on it, and then they used those dance pose representations as a conditioning for a generative model to generate dancing videos of a new person, right? So you just need to transfer appearance from the new person, but preserve the dynamics from the dancer. And this way you can obtain highly realistic videos, both in terms of appearance and motion. For different applications, you can go in. You can go even further. For example, there was one more work from our colleagues in Tel Aviv. This was a paper called Vid to Game. Similar idea in the sense of conditioning GANs on dance pose input, but here they also, so the task here was to take a person and embed them into some sort of game. And here the generation is conditioned both on the pose, but also on the action that you want your character perform. And this, so by doing that, you can actually blend the background from your game with the foreground from the predicted appearance and obtain something quite realistic and entertaining. Okay, and of course, I need to mention that the task of learning correspondences for people is tightly coupled to the task of 3D body pose and shape estimation. You can connect the two in different ways. This was the first attempt from our colleagues from Facebook Reality Labs. This was a paper at ICCV 2019. And their approach to this was to use the dance pose representation as an intermediate step between the input image and the output 3D reconstruction. And the motivation for that was that this way you can use large amounts of synthetic data, but combine real and synthetic inputs not in the image space, but in the dance pose. In the dance pose space, where the domain gap between the two is significantly smaller. And for generating synthetic data set, they've been using mocap data and some synthetic 3D models, and obtain highly realistic poses with also meaningful variation in body shapes. And in this case, you can train your model with a number of different losses, both on synthetic and the real data. And on the real data, where you don't have the 3D ground truth, you can just use, for example, masks or 2D key points and and minimize the reprojection loss from the 3D model. But on the synthetic side, you can actually minimize the reconstruction error directly in 3D. And by doing it jointly, you can significantly improve performance and robustness of your model. So this is one work. I have to say that we have a couple of different projects around 3D body pose and shape estimation. But I think what connects them in the context of today's presentation is that if you want to train something which is working in real-life scenarios, we really need to use in-the-wild images. And for those who, of course, do not have a 3D ground truth, so we need to find efficient ways to leverage 2D annotations or 2D signals. So this was one more paper from this year, which was called Exemplar Fine-Tuning. And the idea here is that you don't actually need that much 3D ground truth to train 3D body pose and shape predictors. You can use some small data sets, for example, human 3.6 million, train predictor for some PL parameters, then obtain predictions from that model on in the wild data sets such as COCO. And what is useful to do here is to perform additional optimization step by fine-tuning your predictor on each specific image from COCO in such a way that the 2D error between key points, like 2D key points that we have in COCO, and the reprojection of those 2D key points from the model would be minimized. And you can see it in somewhat overfitting your network to this specific example, but apparently because of some implicit prior on the distribution of 3D poses that are possible learned by the network, it does not diverge to something completely ridiculous and actually proposes a better variant of the 3D pose as well, even if you just minimize the 2D loss. And then you can use these optimized predictions as something like pseudo ground truth to construct a new data set and retrain your model using in the wild data with these nice labels. And just by doing that, you can actually achieve the state-of-the-art on the task without any complex architectures or additional optimization tricks. Yeah, and for that, we can use the sparse key points, or we can use dense pose. It doesn't really matter, but the point is that 2D representations are largely helpful for 3D pose estimation as well. Okay, so there were just a couple of different examples from the same framework, but the message here is just that it works quite robustly in the wild, and this way you can handle occlusions as well, because you can fit taking into account just a couple of key points. You don't need to have all of them. Okay, so how do we want to extend from here? Of course, helping 3D body pose estimation for humans specifically is one direction which has high practical importance, but also we want to minimize the effort and the cost which is needed for collecting those data sets, and we want to scale both in terms of different scenarios, different data sets, but also different object categories. Right, and then we need to make sure that this scales well in different senses. So one project that we had as a follow-up for the original dense pose paper is to explore what's the what was the optimal strategy for collecting annotations, assuming you have a large set of images of people, but you need to decide what to annotate. And there are a couple of different options. You can either select the subset of those and collect full annotations, including masks, body segmentations, and specific points, or you can use more images, but just annotate a couple of points on each of them, or you can even annotate different modalities, such as masks or key points, and train your network in a multitask setting, hoping that people learn something meaningful for dense pose as well. I will not go into into this too much, but the conclusion of that work was that by optimizing the annotation process, you can obtain quality which is really close to the final performance with just 10% of the data. And this was obtained with mainly collecting a large amount of foreground masks and reducing the number of points, but increasing the number of images, which is not surprising. And also we observed that we can, if, for example, instead of images, we annotate frames from videos, there are a couple of other constraints that we can exploit. For example, we can use optical flow to propagate annotated points from one point to another in a sparse way, or we can impose dense constraints still using optical flow, but saying that, for example, for 2 points in different frames which are related by the optical flow vectors, we want the network to output the same kind of predictions. And to validate the advantages of using video over images, we annotated more data from the post-track data set. It's much smaller than COCO, it's just 8,000 images. It's also much harder because there's a lot of motion blur. And we experimented with different kind of transformations, both in terms of geometry in the image space and also between frames by relating them with optical flow, and impose different dense constraints in terms of equivariance, and also propagated ground truth for those points where we have annotations. Yeah, so this is illustrating how we can do it with geometric transformations, and here the propagation with optical flow. And the conclusion here was that using any kind of transformation, both in terms of geometry and time, is very helpful, especially for the temporal aspects. So even if the optical flow is noisy and the images are blurred, still using several frames of related annotated points is very helpful. Equivariance constraints are not as helpful as the first case, but still have the delta, and these two gains are complementary, and combining the two is still beneficial. Okay, and this was one direction of scaling. Another one is actually going beyond just human category. Right? For example, if we just want to look at humans plus animals, it already gives us 14 million different classes corresponding to 14 million different species, right? And I don't even talk about all possible objects that exist out there. We're somewhat interested in looking at animals specifically because there are a couple of different priors and relationships that we can explore. For example, similarity in topology and body structures between at least some of the categories, which could be interesting source of information, and it will also allow us to reduce the amounts of annotations that would be needed. Okay, so why do we want to understand animals? Of course, there are practical applications for the company who want to understand animal-centered content. People love their pets; they want to see more of them, and also market for pet-related products is growing very fast. There are other reasons to do that, maybe more sane in a way, and one of them is helping earth science and conservation. At this point, we know that different communities in zoology, anthropology, biology, and related disciplines have accumulated quite significant amount of data on animal behavior in terms of images and videos which are captured with camera traps which are installed in their natural surroundings. And there are lots of real-life challenges which they're hoping to solve using this data, but at the same time, this data remains largely unprocessed. So for those who don't know how camera traps look like, this is something like that. So these are cameras which are installed somewhere in the trees. They film their surroundings 24/7, but usually triggered on using the motion sensors. So one attempt to leverage this data was our first collaboration with MPI Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and something I just called Pan-African Program, the Cultured Chimpanzee, that they are driving. And the idea here is that they have now collected a large data sets of videos containing chimpanzees over the course of last 10 years or so. So they have something like several hundreds, thousands of those videos without any annotations. And in this work, we want to actually look into how we can adapt our models trained on humans for pose estimation for chimpanzees without collecting extensive annotations as before. And starting with chimpanzees is interesting because, of course, there are obvious similarities in body structures between the two classes, but at the same time, the appearance is quite different. So this is still quite challenging to address. So our approach was to start with a human pre-trained model. And the idea here is that by running the same which was trained in the human category, but on chimp animals, on chimps, you can get points which are, by establishing correspondences between the two models, two 3D models, the chimp and the human model, you can actually relate predictions on the chimp image to with the 3D model of the chimp. And so this 3D mapping was constructed first manually. So we segmented both SMPL model and chimp model, and based on some sort of segmentation-based descriptor, estimated the mapping between the two in mesh space. And then we trained a network in a teacher-student setup, also using what we call here self-training. And the idea here that we start with the model trained on humans. At the same time, we inject different categories from the COCO dataset containing different animals to improve quality of predictions for the instance masks. And then we retrain the network on the videos of chimpanzees using self-training strategy, where we first run predictor, then select points which have the highest confidence according to our model, and use those to augment our data set and retrain. And one of the nuances here is how you actually want to get your confidence estimates. We looked into that a little bit deeper in our earlier NeRIP submission. And you can do it quite simply by just augmenting your network in predicting not just UV coordinates for given pixel, but seeing it as replacing the single point with a small Gaussian and predicting together with the mean also the variance of this distribution. And this variance would be a reasonable proxy for the uncertainty of this model, which would be somewhat indicative of domain shift as well. And then you can, so you can sample those points based on different categories. You can either look at confidences in UV coordinates and confidences in segmentations or body masks and augment the data. We did a couple of ablations, and the conclusions were that using UV-based confidences are the most meaningful for the task, probably because those outputs contain the most fine-grained information and just allow you to estimate just more sensitive to the domain gap here. Okay, and just to show you the results of that work once again. So here, just a reminder that we did not use any labels on this new category at all. And just by self-training, it's actually performing quite reasonably on the new category and on the old category, which is humans as well, because that's a same model. Okay, and from here, we want to go even further. This was a very specialized project for this specific species, but what we really want to do, the next step is to at least model different mammals within the same framework with a universal predictor. This is something that we looked at very recently. So we worked with different animal categories from the COCO dataset. There are 9. And first, we completely redesigned the way how we learn correspondences here. So instead of segmenting our 3D models into a number of body parts and then having like separately parameterized outputs for each body part, we now have a universal embedding, which is basically trained without any segmentation information. And the idea here is to, for each pixel in your image, output a 16-dimensional embedding, which is then at test time used as a query. So the matching is done in a retrieval framework by learning corresponding dictionary of different embeddings corresponding to different vertices in your 3D model. So you can do it for humans, you can do it for other categories. And the first advantage of it is that, as I said, you don't need the segmentations anymore. The performance is the same or even a little bit better. And if you look at the predictions here, so on in the second column, so the leftmost predictions, these are outputs of the original dense post framework. And because there we predicted patches first and the UV coordinate second, there is no real continuity between different pixels. So we had those seams at the borders of different segments. If we do it in a unified way by learning embeddings, we do not have those anymore. And depending on the dimensionality of your outputs, you can have either over-smoothed embeddings or a little bit more precise, but a little bit more noisy. And there would be some optimal, some global maximum in the middle that would be representing both optimal smoothness and performance. And in terms of losses, we can train it with if we have enough data, enough notations, for example, as for humans, we can see that most of the vertices in the model are actually observable in the ground truth annotations. And in this case, we can just train it with softmax using 27,000 classes corresponding to 27,000 vertices in this NPR model. If the annotations are scarce, and in this case, not all vertices will be annotated at least once in the training data, we found it useful to replace that with a small Gaussian, which is centered at the ground truth location, but on the surface of the 3D model, and train still with cross entropy, but using somewhat smooth approximation. Okay, and the final advantage of doing it this way is that in this framework, we can directly extend the same predictor to other classes. So in this case, the output of our network becomes a universal positional embedding, which can be working with whatever object we have in training data. And the key to make it work is at the same time to train the predictor, but also perform alignment of different 3D models in the mesh space. And in this case, the network learns to relate different points on the surface of different objects, which are somehow semantically corresponding to each other, like the eye of the dog to the eye of the person, and so on. And in practice, it means that instead of just augmented reality filters for people, we can have them for dogs, cats, and other animals. Okay, here's just an illustration of what we can do just by aligning different 3D models in the 3D space. So on the left, this is a dense pose model trained on people using SMPL model reference. And then if you know the mesh mapping, for example, for the horse here at the bottom, then you can immediately map human pixels to horse vertices without any training. And if you want to improve performance on the target category, you can start fine-tuning from there. Okay, and this works very nicely on a whole range of animal categories. Of course, cats and dogs are the hardest because they're the most dynamic, and also there's large variety and textures, but yeah, as I said, this works well, and also generalizes quite nicely to other animal categories as well, even if they were not observed in the training data, just because our predictor is universal and somewhat learns those like structural priors for most of mammals. So here's an example. This is Saiga. This is antelope living in Kazakhstan. It's a quite funny animal, which does not resemble anything which we have in the training data set. But if we run our predictor on this model, you can see that the mapping is somewhat smooth and nice, even though the model normally should have no idea what it's saying. All right, so I'm more or less running out of time, and this is more or less where I wanted to stop. So we've covered, as I said, only one direction of all 3D-related work at FAIR, which is learning correspondences. Our group is, of course, interested in other two as well. So for 3D reconstruction, the key priority for our group specifically is 3D reconstruction with limited supervision or 2D only supervision. In the form of, for example, sparse key points. And we're interested in doing that for people, for animal, for objects, and so on. And the final direction of research is generative models, and this is something that our colleagues in Tel Aviv, for example, are interested as well. And some people in London are working on this too. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. I can take some more questions if you have any.
Okay, thank you. I'm clapping for everyone in the call. Thank you for the great presentation. It's great, like the framework that you described for learning correspondences. I think this is such a fundamental problem in computer vision that if we solve this, then we've unleashed like lots of other applications. So this is great. So I will just put now on the questions because we have quite a number of questions. Okay, I hope you can see them. So, do you have any intuition regarding combining key points detection and depth estimation tasks in order to solve 3D detection of objects?
I'm not sure what is meant by 3D detection. Is it like 3D reconstruction in terms of from model?
I would assume maybe it's referring to like 3D pose of objects, but
yeah, not sure what the framing is. I mean, of course, you can use them in the multitask setting, or you can use, if you have a parametric model, you can use those key points to guide your estimation of parameters or fitting. But yeah, I think the context is important here.
right. Yeah, so we can also hopefully continue the discussion offline. We will also put all these questions in a document, and Natalia can probably give more comments on that. So next question, can including 3D priors also help for general computer vision tasks?
Yeah, well, we're definitely hoping that that's the case. I don't think there is much evidence for that, but definitely there are lots of people or lots of groups who are trying, for example, improve object detection by using 3D priors, and that's definitely different, interesting direction, and I'd be excited to see more results here.
Yeah, so whomever asked, I'm sure later we'll have also Karl Dorsch, and I'm sure, I know he looked into this as well, so maybe we can discuss with him this. So next question, can we accurately reconstruct 3D regions that are not seen in the input images just by using the prior knowledge of the object's class and the textures?
Yeah, I know that there are some works, for example, for combining forward prediction with GANs, and you can think of like synthesizing novel views of your object and just seeing if they fit in your distribution, right? So this is, I think this is definitely possible if you manage to learn priors on how generally the shapes can be distributed.
Okay. So a more general question. What tasks are the biggest challenges in the vision area at the moment? And are there any that are not solvable right now or were tackled with poor results?
Well, I guess one of straightforward answers to that is all those long tail problems, right? And they exist in every task for computer vision, including, for example, I don't know, detection for thousands, like hundreds of thousands categories, right? How do we want to have universal detectors? And that would be scaling to all others, like 3D shape estimation, right? How we do without supervision for new categories that we don't have in the training data. So this is something that's, I think, very limited right now.
Mm. Could real data be replaced by synthetic data in the future?
Well, I know that there are believers and there are non-believers. So definitely the quality of graphics pipeline are improving, and hopefully they will be contributing more and more into at least some of the tasks where we can have some meaningful assumptions and on the context of your task, right? So I think that's not going to be completely replaced, but in some applications, this is definitely going to be helpful.
Okay. Question specific to, solutions that use anthropometric distributions in order to weight anthropometric proportions in terms of facial re-identification or retargeting.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that. I have never worked on this specifically, and I don't think I have a good answer.
Okay, we'll take just maybe a couple more questions. Okay, a very application-oriented question. In order to detect which places on parking lot are occupied, would it be right to first segment the image and detect cars separately, or do you lose some context?
Yeah, I'm not sure why you want to detect cars and Yeah. Okay. I don't know. That's well. I mean, if you detect the car, you can already say that the place is occupied, right? So I guess that's. I'm not sure what the framing is. Sorry.
Okay, let's take one more. How do you classify objects which are of different orientations? So same object, but rotated, translated, or reflected. Do you use data augmentation for this, or some other techniques to cope with?
Yeah, well, the data augmentation is definitely one part of it. You can also think of some other constraints, for example, what I was mentioning before, such as like constraints such as equivariance, right? You can enforce it at the side of the data, but you can also enforce it at the side of the prediction, saying that you have like for points which are related by some transformation and try to reconstruct this transformation from there. So it depends on what you want to do. So you want to classify orientations. Well, I guess you want to be invariant to those informations, right? So that's again. So if you want to enforce the network to have the same response at the points which are related by transformation, you can do it at training time and be invariant, more invariant to that at test time, for example.
Okay, so yeah, I think we're out of time. I don't do. Do you have time to take 2-3 more questions, or should we stop?
Sure. I mean, it's fine with me, as you want.
Oh, okay. So how can we use 3D geometry to recognize actions or gestures?
Facial gesture. Right, I don't think that for full body gestures, this is commonly done. You definitely can go through the 3D pose reconstruction and then try to work in that space. Yeah, I'm not sure that the state of the art of that, and probably because the quality of 3D reconstruction is not yet sufficient to go through this route instead of just direct prediction. But that could be useful in some contexts.
Right. Okay, a sensitive question. Do you think novel ideas proposed in the domain of human pose estimation or texture transfer could be misused, like deepfakes, for instance?
Well, I mean, they definitely could be misused. But again, I would prefer not to go too deep into that.
Okay, fair enough. How do you estimate confidence in terms of probability or?
Yeah, it depends on what kind of output modality you're dealing with. So if this was for UV coordinates, as I said, instead of just coordinate, you may predict the variance so instead of just localizing a single point, you want to localize a Gaussian, but predict both the mean and the variance. If you work with classification problems, for example, body parsing or just foreground segmentation, you can use something like calibrated softmax, where you have additional temperature parameters, which would be somewhat indicative of the confidence of your system. So there are a couple of techniques to do that.
Maybe just one more question. When working on videos, do you do frame-by-frame predictions? So from some applications that you've shown, wouldn't using the videos help in prediction? And if you're not using videos, what are the additional challenges to actually use videos?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of quality, it may definitely be helpful to use some sort of temporal smoothing or any kind of temporal constraints. I guess the downside of that, if we want to have real-time performing networks, it may be adding complexity. So we actually did look into that a little bit for the DensePose track dataset, where we used several frames as an input instead of single framework, and it's definitely was beneficial, but heavier on the compute side.
Okay, great. So maybe we'll stop here, and we will take all these questions offline, and we will send you, Natalia, a document where you could add answers to the questions for the ones that were not answered. So thank you so much again, and I'm clapping here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.